Hello and welcome to another Back to Jerusalem podcast. I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, and I'm coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of Sweden. This time I have our office director from the UK, Bethany, with us today. Bethany, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I really wanted to bring you on to talk about something that we just released, which is this China handbook from 1896. And even though it sounds like a long time ago, I read it and I really feel like a lot of the things that those missionaries wrote like 150 years ago still apply today.
Well, people that have followed us when it comes to our books and for underground publishing, they'll know that it's been a while since we've put anything out. We had a few months where we were doing several, and then there's been a bit of a break. And that's because we really are trying to stick to this idea that unless we come across something that really feels like we have to get this out there, that we've kind of rediscovered this hidden treasure, then we don't do anything. We don't kind of just put books out there for no reason. But when we do find books that we find really inspiring, sometimes that can mean we do 3 books in 2 months. Sometimes it can mean there's several months with no books. And this was one of those books that you came across and said, hey, you need to read this. I think this would be really amazing because it's such a unique find, I think.
And I mean, this has been a part of our story for so long. When we did Chasing Revival, for instance, we didn't do it just like segments of, okay, this is a 30-day devotional. Every day has a designated 300 words. So therefore, if you're inspired more, you have to cut somewhere in the editing process. If you're inspired less, you have to add to that inspiration in order to make it fit into this really defined square of where, God comes from, you think. And so you and I, as we've looked at books through our Back to Jerusalem journey, so a lot of the things that we do on the mission field, as well as with the printing, as you were talking about with Underground Printing House, when we look at materials, we don't publish anything because we're not on a schedule. We don't work for anybody in the way that, we have deadlines or we have a time schedule. So we just wait until we come across old writings that inspire us. And in many ways, you were the inspiration for this handbook coming out because you came to me sharing about this book that you were reading together with the missions department at your church. And that missions department book sucked. Like it talked about, cross-cultural, what was it called? Like intelligence or something?
Yeah, I'm not going to say the name of the book and we're not going to say the author. And I love my missions department at our church, but somebody had recommended this book to me.
But they gave you a sucky book.
They gave me a terrible book. And I told them that. But I also think it's great for us to be exposed to things we would never normally read. And that was a book I would have never picked up. And so it was good for me to read it and decide I, in fact, did not agree with it. But yeah, it was really difficult to read because it was this idea that we have to prioritize. It's very hard for me to explain, but basically it was like you have to prioritize the other person that you're sharing the gospel with, their feelings. And if they feel that they might be offended by what you share culturally, because ultimately it was trying to present this idea that Christianity was Western, which of course we all know is not true. It was just very difficult about the way that missionaries should behave. And it also shared a lot about how the church is the number one cause of racial division, which was a bizarre point to make. And it kind of would just like do these mic drops. It would like do these points, it would drop and then move on. Like it hadn't just said the most ridiculous thing ever.
Just that segment, when you were telling me, you told me many different parts because you and I being exposed to missions, being exposed to the Chinese, working together with the Chinese, when you told me, because this is not the only voice. I mean, what you read was like one of the most probably influential books. It was very academically written. It comes very highly recommended by some of the largest mission organizations and missionaries, maybe. But when they start making accusations like Christianity is the main reason for racism in the world today, I start looking at the founding fathers of bringing equality to our world. All of them, almost across the board, were Christian, and it was the Christian Judaic foundations that was used as the centerpiece of this idea of equality that we now see in many different democracies around the world and embraced, at least in theory, if not in practice, by the international community, like at the United Nations. That was all pushed by the Christians and the Christian belief following after Jesus Christ. It didn't come from Muhammad because he's huge racist. Didn't come from Gautama Siddhartha. It didn't come from the writers of the Book of Hindu. It came from Christianity. So that accusation came with these little really weak arguments based on someone's experience in a church that, had racism. Whereas the people that we work together with, the people that we write about, the individuals that wrote this book, this handbook for China, they had left their nation, became a chosen minority in their nation where God called them, and served the people of a different language, different culture, different people group, and different race, trying to show the equality that God brings and value to all people. That was just, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, this was a book that came recommended by people on the missions board for a very, very large denomination here in the UK. So it's a book that is been widely read. And so the end of that story is that I finished reading it. It was very frustrating to read. Some points were fine, but there were others that I found really problematic and things that could be taken by a young missionary. So it could be such a dangerous book in that way. And so one of the criticisms I think I know can sometimes be given to the Chinese church is there's a lack of training, that the missionaries are not prepared properly, that they don't have the theological seminaries that they need to be sent out. And so all of those things are kind of swirling around. And then we come across this China mission handbook from 1896. And we start to see that actually these missionaries were trained. The first ones that went out kind of did the groundwork and came up with this in Shanghai, so that the missionaries that came after them would have something to go off. And we found it pretty amazing. And then there's something in the back that I don't know if you want to talk about now or we can come to later.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was looking at the training manual, I thought this training manual is the antithesis of encouraging missionaries to go to the field. It basically tells you that because of your race, because of your nationality, you are not as good on the mission field as others. So it basically, in my mind, would make a lot of Westerners, specifically Caucasian Westerners, not want to go to the mission field. It would also...
You don't mean this one, you mean the one I read.
Yeah, the one that you read, modern day. So this was from a modern day mission training handbook. And when you point out the fact, or when I say you, this idea of whoever is a part of that idea of being culturally relevant, culturally intelligent, I think was the specific term that they used, cultural intelligence. When we try to focus on this cultural intelligence, it leads us down a road that's not necessarily Christian, which I believe is exactly what the enemy wants. So you start doing things like talking about Buddhism or Hinduism or New Age theology in a way that legitimizes it and delegitimizes Christianity. I'm not talking about finding inroads. You and I are all about that. We're all looking for common ground. We're always looking for ways that we can minister the gospel in new cultures and new religions. What I'm specifically targeting in this new age kind of mission training guidebook is that when you give so much emphasis to those other religions, I'm starting to think, who are you actually an evangelist for? Because they started to say things like, they started to use the word like Palestine for the place where Jesus grew up. They used terminology about Christians that are racist, ignorant, not well trained. Not well trained by who? I mean, if we look at the very first missionaries, it's one of the ways that we ended the Chasing Revival series as well as began it, is talk about when the missionaries left out, or not missionaries, the disciples. When Jesus resurrected and went into heaven in Acts chapter 1 and 2, one of the things that we see is that there was a group of disciples that were like, okay, where to now? What do we do now? Jesus didn't set up a training seminar per se. He didn't give them language instruction. He didn't give them all of these different things that we might put into a course and then anoint somebody with a degree. Instead, he just simply said, go. And his training was life. He lived with them. He ate with them. He slept with them. He drank with them. Like everything that he did in life, they learned from observation with him, which is what we see from the Chinese. Maybe they're not trained in the traditional sense, but they were discipled, which is why we have these different terms for discipleship and for education. Those two could be the same, but sometimes they're not the same, even though we might use them interchangeably. And in today's day and age, we see so much focus on education and very, very little on discipleship. When you look at that book, that handbook from the 1800s that was put together by those early missionaries in China, you see a difference. And this is why I like going back to these old writings, because sometimes I think that in our generation, we begin to think that we've moved past these guys. We got so much more information now. We're so much more intelligent. These guys wrote this handbook without Google. They wrote it without an Encyclopedia Britannica. They wrote it without an education in the traditional sense that we think about it today in Western Europe or America or Australia. They wrote it from what they had been discipled, and out of this, and out of their experiences, out of this came a handbook that when I read it, I was blown away. I was blown away at the depth of knowledge of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Islam. I was blown away at their ability to talk about history, historical individuals that even today when I'm Googling, I find it extremely difficult to find the same information that they had.
But why did they have it? They had it because they wrote out of experience. So those first missionaries that went out didn't have anything, right? They were starting basically with nothing. They hadn't even been able to Google China like before they left out just to see what it looked like. They had absolutely no clue what they were walking into. But it meant that, I mean, you have two options, right? Do you have missionaries that go with nothing and then develop a training handbook based on what they've lived and experienced? Or do you get the missionary societies back home that have never set foot in China to write a training manual? You can argue which one's going to be more efficient and useful, but I would imagine it's the first one. And so I think that those early missionaries understood the challenges that they faced, and they realized, okay, we don't want the next generation to make the same mistakes that we did. They'll make their own mistakes anyway. We don't need them to make the same ones that we made, which is the whole point of Underground Publishing House. It's the whole point of why we do this project, if you want to call it that, at Back to Jerusalem, is we want to learn from previous generations. We're going to make our own mistakes. Let's not also make the mistakes of the generations before us. Let's learn from them. And so that's what I feel that this handbook is. And it's not just a, here's how to be a missionary. That's not what it is when we say a handbook. It's kind of all the information you would need if you were walking into China as a missionary. It's here's what the landscape spiritually, in terms of religion, practically, here's what it looks like, here's what you're going to walk into, and here's what you need to know as you go and serve in China.
And let me just say that I'm writing a book right now about a missionary that served in China in the 1800s, in the 1830s, half a century before this book was even written. And in fact, he was a part of setting up that stage together with Robert Morrison and those early missionaries for the missionaries who wrote this handbook. The same criticisms were available from the Christian body at that time, that you need to have a certain level of education, and you need to have a certain level of cultural intelligence, and you need to have a certain level of language abilities. One of the things that is very difficult for us to understand is that in the 1800s, when Robert Morrison, the very first Protestant missionary to go to China, went to China, China hadn't even been properly mapped. No, they didn't even know what the geographical layout of China looked like. It wasn't until Robert Morrison that we got our very first kind of mapping of the Korean Peninsula, which is attached to China, for those of you that, might be geographically impaired. that information, that data was not available to the missionaries. So not only could they not Google China and watch a couple of YouTube clips from China, they were not even able to completely understand the layout of the land until they got there and experienced it for themselves. And a lot of the information that governments in Europe, like England or the Netherlands, or even America, a lot of the information they got relied on that first-hand experience of the missionaries.
Yeah, that's why they're called pioneers, right? Because they're pioneers in so many ways. We've talked several times about the Duff, an expedition that you could look at as being a failure, where a mission society thought, let's try and get a boat and do our, instead of relying on other trading companies and things, let's try and do this ourselves. And these missionaries went through failures and successes. But the truth is, so much of what we know today that we take for granted as being common knowledge was actually because of what these missionaries did, the experiences that they had. I think something that's interesting about this book, this Missions Handbook from the 1800s too, is it really does shine a light on some areas of Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism that we might not know or might not think of, because, this was 200 years ago. How were people following Buddhism 200 years ago? What did it look like? They called them Mohammedans. They wouldn't even call them Muslims, because at that time people weren't really using that phrase. And so it's very interesting to kind of get that real kind of a raw experience of those religions face to face, and what they all look like operating in one country. And as a missionary arriving from England or Scotland, as a lot of these ones did, or Wales, what happens when you step into an environment when you have all of these religions happening at the same time? How do you even begin to approach that? And so I think that's the amazing thing is, yes, it's about China, but to be honest, if you were going to the Middle East or India or anywhere else, there's things in this book that would be completely fascinating and completely relevant for missionaries.
I mean, that's one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating and unique about this training handbook, is that as I went through and I was reading about Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, there are details in there from 150, 200 years ago that the people learned through experience that are still absolutely correct and relevant today. Nothing has changed. The way that those religions might be portrayed in the West has changed, but the way that they practice. Now, I've written quite a bit about Buddhism and Islam. I've written quite a bit, from the perspective, not just my perspective as an observer. Individuals, like we just came out with a book, or we will come out with a book in October, about a Muslim who grew up in a very radical Muslim family as the grandson of an Ayatollah. We just had a book come out this month about a Pakistani, from a Pakistani experience being persecuted as a Christian in an Islamic society. Before that, we came out with another book about Tibetan Buddhism, the very root of Buddhism that we see in the world today, told by not by someone who observed Buddhism, but someone who was trained by the Dalai Lama to be a Lama in charge of his monastery, and lived as a Buddhist, studied as a Buddhist, and led as a Buddhist. The essence that I learned from them, I found in clear black and white in this handbook from 1896. I'm like, wow, if I would have read these guys from the very beginning, from my very first time in China, even before I arrived in China in the 90s, if I would have read in the 90s from those writers from the 1890s, I would have been so much better prepared for China. I wouldn't have had to learn this from scratch. And I think that's the beauty of bringing this book back out, dusting the dust off of it, and making it available to an audience from today.
Well, and to go off of the book that I read several weeks ago from Modern Day, this idea that, we as Christians go into countries almost with a bullying attitude. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, I'm sure it does, but this generalization that that's what Christian missionaries have done and do. In this book, yes, they talk about the problems with all of these religions, but it's also the For anybody that read A Voice in the Darkness by Griffith John, one of my favorite parts about what Griffith John wrote, which was this idea that, and I'm going to butcher it, but basically it was everything good in these religions is also found in Christianity. Everything bad in these religions is not in Christianity. And everything that's kind of halfway there is completed to perfection in Christianity. And this concept that it's not that every single one of these religions have evil in every aspect of it, but actually there's some good in it, but it doesn't compare to the good within Christianity. That there's bad in it that's not found in Christianity. And there's hints of kind of a halfway there that's perfected within Christianity. And so it's not a book that kind of knocks down every religion that these guys saw 200 years ago, which is the idea, right? These white guys went into China and decided everybody was doing everything wrong and they were all evil and they all needed the white Christians to kind of come and show them the way. That's not the way that they speak. They speak with a love for the people of China. They speak with a love for the people that are lost in Islam and Confucianism and Taoism and all these other religions. And so it really gives you a fully rounded idea of these religions and what they looked like. And also, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but the amazing thing was you found yourself in China looking at a handbook being used today inside of China to train missionaries while we were looking at this very same book. So there was kind of a really amazing symmetry that we found.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel that it was the timing of the Holy Spirit, because at the training that I was at, I was not supposed to be there. I had not planned to be there. I had other meetings in China. And the pastor that I've worked very closely with for many years just asked me to come and attend a leadership meeting. And the leadership meeting I assumed was going to be among 5 top leaders. But in China, we don't talk very clearly on devices, right? I'm not writing details. If you are an individual that needs to have everything known about your agenda for travel, you don't belong in China today, not working with the church anyway, because working with the church means that you have to go by faith in a lot of things, and you have to submit to the agenda of the leadership that is in China and just take it at faith that their agenda is exactly what God wants you to do. So when I arrived in China with my own agenda, but another agenda was presented to me by the pastor that basically said this: come and meet us. That was it. Why? How long? Where at? Like, should I prepare anything? None of that information is given. So I just got into a car, went to sleep, slept for, I think, 2 or 3 hours on the way to this training facility, which is held inside of a factory. And so I go into this factory and learn that I'm going to be, speaking for about 12 hours. So I mean, I'm just hit all of a sudden with the task of preaching and teaching at a Bible school for missionaries in China. And when I say missionaries in China, these are Chinese missionaries that are being trained by the underground church. We are in a facility that is a secret training facility for missionaries. And while I'm there, there's a printout. So it's not printed in the way that it's a proper binding, right? This is a printout that came from a computer printer, that is really, really cheesy. So I'm holding several pages that all of the other students have. And I'm looking at this document, and it is a Chinese missionary handbook. And I was like, who wrote this? And so I asked the pastor, who wrote this? And he said, we did. And they put it together from their experience to share with the younger missionaries who are going to the field. But what I was struck most by was the very end of that training manual. The end of that training manual ended in a completely different way than a cultural intelligence book that I would get in a mission training ceremony from, seminary from today. It was a level of dedication that even shocked me after all these years of being in China. It was the last will and testament for the missionaries. So if you go through this missionary training curriculum together with the Chinese underground house church leaders, at the end, when you graduate, you sign your own death warrant. You sign your own last will and testament. And so every student that graduated signed this last paper. And we had one of the missionaries that was there together with me translate it from Chinese into English. None of this stuff originated in English. So this is the first time that this last will and testament has ever been revealed. And we put it in the back of this book. And as well as with other things, but for that last will and testament, could you just read from that, Bethany? It's not very long, but I think that if you read it, it would give the audience an idea of the level of commitment of these new missionaries that are leaving from China and going into the most harsh nations against Christianity in the world today.
Yeah, before I do as well, I think it's just such a beautiful image to bear in mind that these pioneers that went and wrote the China Handbook that's in my hand, their dream was that there would be native Chinese training other native Chinese to go and be missionaries. That was what they literally gave their lives for, was that there would be Chinese that were so committed to Christ, that so understood the gospel, that so had that revelation of who God was in their own lives, that they were training one another up. And so I think just to add that small point in there, that it kind of is that full circle idea that 90% of this book is what the pioneers were training missionaries to do. And the end few pages of this book is kind of the fulfillment of everything that these guys dreamed of and gave everything for. Like Eugene said, there's several parts of the mission training that's being used in China today in the back of the book. But the very last thing is called the Last Will and Testament that I'll read now. So it says, missionaries, male and female, should submit one copy of this document to their parents, children, brothers, or closest relatives or guardians, and one to the church. And it begins, Dear Mum and Dad, I am your son/daughter, and then a place for them to write their name. I thank the Lord for allowing me to grow up in such a happy and God-fearing family, and I am even more grateful to Dad and Mum for raising me. You gave your precious child to God for the sake of his kingdom. Through the cultivation of the Lord's grace and the guidance of the Holy Spirit, I received God's life and am a partaker of the great commission of God's kingdom. When I was called by God to leave home, it also meant I would devote my life to the restoration of the kingdom of God and could not stay by your side to fulfill my filial piety. But I will pray for you and ask God to give you health. I also hope that you will pray for your child. If one day I should leave the world on the field for the kingdom of God, please do not be sad. You should be happy because you have given birth to an excellent missionary for the kingdom of God. It is a special honor given by God to our family to give my life to his service. If I am in the field, as long as it is for the Lord's sake, he is my only hope. He only has one requirement, that is, that I must give my life completely to his calling. Please don't ask after me or worry about my well-being. I belong to the Lord. He loves me and laid down his life for me, and I am also willing to follow his example and lay down my life for him. Don't carry my body back from the field. Please bury me like a seed on the field where I serve. Let your child become the Lord's testimony and a blessing to the land. Yours, a place for them to sign their name and the date.
So powerful. And in many ways, I think about the individuals who say that Christianity is the source of racism. The ignorance of that statement, and the anti-Christian behavior behind that statement is challenging for me to understand how Christians of mission organizations embrace those ideas. These individuals are giving their lives as Chinese to live and die in Pakistan, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen. They're doing that today. And they're doing it in the footsteps of the disciples that went before them. Those disciples that went before them are the biblical disciples, but also those that came after the biblical disciples. Those early Christians, those early Coptic Christians of Egypt and Ethiopia. Those early Syriac Christians from Syria and Iraq. Those early Christians from the monasteries in Western Europe. those early Christians from the revival fires of the Great Awakening on the prairies of America. Today, the Chinese underground church is in that same stream. One of the amazing things is that when you look at other religions around the world, Islam, it is extremely colonial and racist, where you see the Arab Peninsula, the language, the culture, the religion being demanded from all followers around the world, and that you even have to do a pilgrimage to Mecca as a part of that religion. Same thing with Buddhism. You have the center of Buddhism, which is Lhasa, Tibet. And from there, all the other springs, whether it is the Buddhism that is practiced in Japan or Thailand or Cambodia, or, you know, the yoga circles in Los Angeles, wherever you are experiencing Buddhism, it all goes back to this geographical, cultural location. But Christianity is different. Christianity has transformed throughout the ages in different nations. It has adopted to, or I should say, the people have adopted to it, whether that they are Iraqi or Middle Eastern or European or African, or in this case, Chinese. We have seen their expressions different and just as holy. We have seen the ways that they follow after Christ different, but just as holy. And the words that Jesus said still rings true today, which is this: where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in their midst. Whether they are praying in Chinese in Beijing or whether they are praying in English in London, it doesn't matter. God is with them. When he gave his life on the cross, he gave his life to make his temple inside his people. That's why we're called the church. The church is not a building that the people go to. The people are the church, that God has put his kingdom inside of their hearts, inside of their lives. And we see that today, which goes past every geographical boundary. It goes past every or joins together every language, every tongue. It doesn't eliminate any language or tongue. And that's what we're seeing here with the Chinese. And that's what we saw with these early missionaries in the 1800s that wrote this first book. Was there any part of the book that kind of jumped out to you when you first read it for the first time?
No, I can't say that there was a specific part. It was so much of the way that they talked about the different religions was such a different way than I'd ever experienced before. Especially when I went into it with thinking it was a training manual. There's so much of a departure from training manuals today. In the tone, even there's just so much of it. It's not, you need to do A, B, and C before you can be a good missionary. It's, we want to expose you to as much information as possible that we have learned as missionaries that you're going to need. Like I said, it wasn't from a seminary back home, from people that have never lived. I mean, these guys lived and died and lost children out there and built hospitals for the first time and saw first converts in parts of China that had never been reached before. These guys, when we say pioneers, that's really who they were. And so for me, I can't pick one part of this. It's the entire notion of this book is so different than any handbook that I would think of today. And in truth, that's why we want to republish this and we're coming out with it, because we come out with books that we feel meet a need or a lack in today's options, where there is something missing maybe that these older books still have because we've neglected them. And so, yeah, for me, the reason that we did this was because of that. It fills a void that I think is found in the writings about how to be a missionary today.
There's a Finnish word that really doesn't translate very well into English or any other language that I know of. It's they actually just came out with a movie based on this Finnish word called sisu. And sisu is like this grit, this ability to just endure all things and push through all things. It's like I said, you have to describe the word because there's not really an English word that's an adequate translation for sisu. These first pioneers had sisu. They had grit. They had experience. They had courage. And I think we lack that a lot today in not just Western seminaries, but maybe Western culture. Courage to grab the truth, hold on to the truth in the face of whatever. And there's a lot of people that will try to make Christians feel guilty about their beliefs, feel bad about their history, feel ashamed of their missionary endeavors in the past by laying it all out there. One of the things that I have noticed, I'm writing a book, like I've said earlier, about a Christian missionary from the early 1800s. He went into China, and everything that is written about him today, this missionary, everything that's written about him today basically calls him a colonialist, calls him an elitist, calls him a drug dealer, calls him a swindler. Like all of these different names are attached to him. So I have researched their writings as much as possible, and here's the conclusion that I've come to. All of the ammunition that they use against him was written by him. And all of the ammunition that they used to show how righteous the people were was written by him. He talked about how bad he was and how good the people were. That's what Christians do. They kind of talk about their sins in a way that cleanses them. The Bible highlights the heroes of the Bible and makes their sins transparent to the reader, to the follower of Christ. Whereas all the other religions, they hide it, including secularism. They take their heroes and they make them sanitized of any wrongdoing, of any problems, of any sins. I can't go into China today and talk about the millions, the tens of millions that were killed by Mao Zedong. I can't talk about the evil things that the Communist Party has done and is doing because they want to completely sanitize themselves of all the wrong that they've done. But when they go back, when the Communist Party specifically has targeted missionaries, this missionary in particular, and they go back and they highlight all the things that he has done wrong, I realize that all of their ammunition, all of their material came from the missionary himself. He wrote about how horrible he was, how much of a failure he was, and how good the people were. But he also talked about the challenges of the people, the hardship that they caused one another, the misery of being in China in the 1800s, the misery of being Chinese at the time. At the time that these missionaries wrote this booklet, the emperor of China did not like Christians, did not want Christianity in his country. And why would he? The idea of the emperor at that time was that everybody existed to benefit him, which is in direct contrast to the missionaries, because the missionary believes I exist to be a benefit to God's people, to bring God's word, to benefit the people. The emperor believed that everybody must sacrifice so that he could be exalted. The idea of the missionary, at the root of the heart of the missionary, is that I must sacrifice to bring others to Christ.
I think as we wrap this up here as well, it leads on to our book that we'll come out with also this week. So it's a bit of a sneak peek, but so many of these original missionaries, the pioneer missionaries, they didn't go out because they read a great training manual. They went out because somebody came to them, like a David Livingstone, and said, this is what I'm doing. Someone else has to go. Another missionary wrote from the field. Amy Carmichael writes from the field and says, we need more people out here. This is what I'm doing. This is what we're giving. This is what we're dealing with. And we need more people. And we're coming out with a book this week called The Book of Missionary Heroes. And it is I love this one, but it's my favorite one that we have ever put out so far. And it fills the void that I think you're talking about, which is talking about those heroes, not giving a 3-year, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with missionary training schools. Heroes right there. But when you remove real life testimonies, when you take away those real life heroes, because suddenly politics makes it seem that we can't put these people in a place to be admired anymore, we lose the ability for people to have courage because they have no inspiration. And so, yeah, that will lead on to our next one that I'm sure we'll do a different episode about. But this book is not just for those people that want to go and be a missionary to China. It truly is if you are interested in what the landscape looked like 200 years ago for missionaries. And if you want to see the way that the missionaries are being trained today inside of China, I think that this book would be fascinating.
And I also believe that if you want to see the heart of what started the foundation of missions in China, what the church today, the underground church today, with the explosion and the revivals and the millions of people that are coming to Christ, this is one of the few documents that we can read that is the foundation.
Yeah.
This was the foundation of the very first pioneers that went into China. And it gives us a sneak peek into the mindset, the methodology, and the understanding of those very first missionaries who went into China and planted the seeds for what we are seeing today. Yeah, I want to thank you so much, Bethany, for coming, sharing about this new book that we have, and also reading from that powerful last will and testament that is now being used by the Chinese.
So if anyone wants to get their hands on it, you can get it on Amazon, any Amazon. You can find it on there. It's called the China Missions Handbook. You can search that. It comes right up. Or you can get it through backtojerusalem.com or undergroundpublishing.co.uk.
I want to thank you guys so much for joining us for another Back to Jerusalem podcast. Again, I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of England and Sweden. God bless you guys.